Welcome to our launch event for a new report on the trade and industrial policy options for the European automotive industry. I'm Nicolas Köhler-Suzuki from the Jacques Delors Institute in Paris, and I will be moderating today's event. So, over the past year, the Jacques Delors Institute and the Paris School of International Affairs at Sciences Po in Paris have interviewed more than 70 stakeholders across the European automotive industry. We also organized a series of events last fall to identify policy options that can bridge different interests that exists amongst the different industry players, OEMs, suppliers, large and small. And we are happy to finally present our findings today, and we hope that they can also help to inform the ongoing strategic dialogue on the future of the automotive industry that was recently launched by the European Commission. And to open our event today, I'm honored to pass over to someone who needs no long introduction, Pascal Lamy, who is the former Director General of the World Trade Organization and the former European Commissioner for Trade. Amongst the many hats he is wearing today, he is also the coordinator of the Jacques Delors Institutes in Berlin, Brussels, and Paris. Pascal joins us live via Zoom. Pascal, thank you for being with us. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Nicolas. I hope you can hear me well. Good morning to everybody. Who killed the EU car industry? If this was to be the title of a detective novel, the answer would be many hands. Many hands, like in Murder on the Orient Express by Agatha Christie.
Could you speak a little bit louder?
It's the purpose of our report, which is about the contrary. How to avoid such a scenario before it's too late. What we have tried to do is to identify the problem and to provide the many stakeholders we have consulted, as well as the European policymakers, with a framework for a new, hopefully decisive course of action. According to us, the root of the problem lies in a double imbalance. The first imbalance between the three objectives, which need to be pursued simultaneously to switch to electric mobility, i.e. Decarbonation, number one, competitiveness, number two, and security of the value chains, number three. Decarbonation has so far taken the upper hand for good reasons, but to the detriment of the two others, competitiveness and security. The second imbalance, which is not unrelated to the first one, lies between policy instruments, where regulation and trade instruments have superseded industrial policy, understood as supply and demand side actions. This has happened for various reasons, including the distribution of competences between the EU and its member states. The good news is that there is now a collective realization that we have reached a critical point and that a serious reaction is needed, as evidenced by the launch of the strategic dialogue by the EU Commission. This dialogue is the reason why we have not listed a classical ready-to-use set of recommendations, but a list of options to be considered by the many players collectively about choices that can go in one direction or the other on one condition, which is that the sum of these choices on the options we have listed result in a coherent strategy. I am personally convinced that we need a new, bold, all-encompassing strategy, and that we will not get there by a few incremental adjustments. Now, this is my personal opinion, and my hope is that the conclusions of the strategic dialogue will match this tall order, especially tall given the many new uncertainties stemming from Trump's erratic, misguided, and all-damaging trade policies. This new element, of course, has also to be factored in the conclusions, which hopefully will base this new strategic approach. Before handing back the floor to our moderator, let me thank first the team of researchers from the Institut Jacques Delors Paris and Sciences Po, which we have supervised with Arancha, González, Laya. I want to thank them for their dedication, for their hard work, and I must say, after a few months, for the passion with which they have been pursuing this collective achievement. I also want to thank the ACEA for having trusted us to do this work and for having fully respected our academic independence. And of course, I also want to thank in advance our panelists this morning for their availability, while we also understand why Commission officials have refrained to participate while the strategic dialogue is still underway. Thanks for your attention, and over to you, Nicolas, our moderator this morning.
Thank you, Pascal, for setting the stage. So we will now move to our panel, and I am very pleased to be joined by a distinguished group who will share with us their views on the different themes that we have in this report. So right next to me is Marie-Pierre Vedrenne, a member of the European Parliament in the Renew Group, and is sitting in the Committee for International Trade. Next to her, we have Sigrid Vries, the Director General of the European Automobile Manufacturers Association, ACEA. And to my far right is Arancha González Laya, the Dean of the Paris School of International Affairs at Sciences Po in Paris, and one of the co-authors of our report. Joining us online is Benjamin Krieger, Secretary General of the European Association of Automotive Suppliers, CLEPA. So without further ado, let's dive into the three themes we have in our report, which are decarbonization, competitiveness, and economic security. And afterwards, we will also have some time for a Q&A with the audience. We will probably have to end this a couple minutes before 11 o'clock today because of some commitments by some of our panelists. So let's begin with our first theme, decarbonization. As you all know, the EU has set itself the target to fully decarbonize by 2050. To get there, we will also have to decarbonize road transport, which is about a quarter of emissions. And the target is to have full decarbonization of all newly registered cars by 2035. But this timeline, which is more ambitious than those of any other country in the world, brings up some rather difficult questions. How can we make sure that decarbonized mobility is affordable enough for European consumers? And how can we be sure that we build the infrastructure that can support this transition? So with those questions in mind, I'd like to ask our panel to share with us where Europe stands today on this issue. How are we doing decarbonizing the automotive sector? And I would like you to identify for us the most important policy measures that you think can help us accelerate this transition from now until 2035. Let's start with Marie-Pierre Vedrenne. Is Europe's decarbonization agenda on the right path?
So, firstly, thank you for your invitation. I'm really happy to be with you this morning and to more sometimes listen how you can move forward your study. What are your Pascal Lamy said you have a lot of options on the table, and I think that we are confronted with big challenges, not only on this study and how we really implement and how we try to work on decarbonization, competitiveness, and economic security, but the future of Europe more generally. We are just talking before how we act, how we react, how we don't act. And sometimes I have the feeling that now, especially since 1 week, we are quite surprising. In fact, it was not a surprise that the world is changing. And it's true that during the previous mandate, in the European Parliament and with the commitment of member states and the Commission, we are always talking about decarbonization and about the Green Deal. And it's true that we need to continue to engage all the stakeholders and also the sector automotive to move on this way. But the key question, and you ask this question, it's how we really balance all the objectives. It's a key question, in fact. I think that the question is not only to talk about decarbonization, competition, economic security, it's the balance and the key objective. Okay, if we want decarbonization, at the end, maybe we will have no more industry inside the EU. But it's also an impact of social effect on all the territory. So, of course, as member of European Parliament, and because I think that we need to tackle the issue of climate change, I put this objective on the table. And we need to act, but we need also not only to engage stakeholders inside EU, we need to engage stakeholders also outside EU. And we know that we have value chain, especially on the automotive sector, who are completely globalization. So I think as legislator, we need maybe more to listen industrial actors and to work on how on industrial process it's possible to decarbonize and also to continue to produce in EU. So for me, of course, and the question, for example, of the price of energy is very important, and we need to act on this. When we talk with all the sectors, this question is very important, because if we want after to react and to act on the question of competitiveness, we need to really work on this aspect. So I think that during the previous mandate, we work on the framework, on market design, but it was not enough. And you know that we are working now on the question of simplification, on the future of some omnibus. I think that we have the objective, and you are all engaged in order to achieve the question of target the climate change, but how it's possible to really be efficient on the objective. I think that the role of the legislator is not only to put the objective, but how we are really efficient in order to achieve this objective. And I think that when we put on the table a lot of legislation on the question of the Green Deal, sometimes we create a framework who are not really helpful in order to be really neutral. So I think that with the high now agenda of simplification, it's very important to concretely not put on the trash the objective, but really to be efficient on how concretely we achieve this goal in production in the EU. So for me, I think it will be the job of the European Parliament to really work on this, on CSRD, on due diligence, on taxonomy, how it's possible to have investment inside EU when we change the value chain in EU, but also when we engage on the value chain all the actors outside the EU. So we will work on this. I think that now in the Parliament and in the Commission and also in Member States, we know that it's a big challenges and we need to work together on this. But it's true that sometimes also when we discuss with all the actors on different sectors, we have the actor, for example, the producer on automotive, we have the supply chain, we have some member states, and of course, the discussion and the proposal on the table are not completely the same. So I think that with the strategic dialogue, we need to be agreed on 1 or 2, 3 maximum key objectives and to go concretely member states, industrial, legislator on the same way. Because at the end, if each party of the supply chain of the member states go on different direction, we will have nothing.
Thank you. Sigrid, are we on track to decarbonize the automotive industry by 2035?
No. That's the short answer, but I'll try and explain that a bit further. But thanks, first of all, for the invitation. Also, thank you for drafting this very rich report and putting a lot of thought into it, consulting also with many partners. I think the trilemma that you point at, decarbonization, improving competitiveness, and also economic security, they are absolutely spot on, and they are the critical issues that we find ourselves in and also have to deal with. So on your question, are we on track with decarbonization? No. You could be even more blunt and say we're actually in for a car crash. Because we have very ambitious targets. We also have vehicles readily available to enter the market, both on the passenger cars and the vans and also trucks and truck side. But we are facing a stagnating demand. And if you would take a step back and sit in a helicopter for a moment, if you look where we are today with almost 15% electric vehicle cars market share in the market in less than 5 years, that's by any standards remarkable. I don't think even China managed that in the first phase of their transformation. But it's not enough if you put it in the context of what is required by EU legislation, which says that in 2025, we need to be at about 25% rather than close to 15% market share. And what we see is that a transition, and everybody knew that, but it's now emerging with real-world facts. A transition is a bumpy road. You need to convince many actors, and in this case, it's not just a technology transfer, but it's a systemic change. So you need targets, you need vehicles, technology, you need green electricity and also affordable electricity, and you also need actually those driving, using, buying and riding the cars to make that transformation. And they are more hesitant than I think many of us envisaged and expected, and also in the context again of the regulatory framework that we see is the case. So we have a demand issue at the moment. On the one hand, that leads to the risk of a substantial economic cost on the side of the automotive industry, because they are forced to digest not reaching targets by either paying penalties or pooling with non-EU competitors by squeezing their supply chain, which has an impact on suppliers by reducing the number of vehicles they produce to reach their EV market share, because it's always an averaging out, or by reducing the prices at which they sell. And as you can read in the EU investigation report for on import tariffs on cars coming from China, already today EU manufacturers produce electric vehicles at a significant loss, and you can't sustain that for a very long time. So the risk of this very substantial economic cost is the most urgent thing that we face now as an industry and also as EU, because this is not just an industry problem, it's a European problem, because there, you know, the manufacturing footprint is at stake, employment is at stake, and also innovative capacity to keep investments flowing, to keep actually this transformation on track. All of that is at stake. So we need to, as part of the strategic dialogue, see some short-term relief measures for industry, and aside from that, and that's very important too, the EU needs to double down on enabling conditions, so charging infrastructure and refilling infrastructure, but also demand-side measures to make sure that there is a more stable and an acceleration also in the market, in the uptake of electric vehicles. And then there are all the value chain, the competitiveness issues, trade issues, and I think we dive into that a little later also in this event. But yeah, so are we on track? No. Can we still be on track? Yes, but it really needs a huge effort, and I think the recognition is there, the sense of urgency is there in the Parliament, in the Commission, Member States as well. It needs a lot of working together, indeed focusing on first things first, but then also really opening up for a reality check down the road, because this transformation has been put in law in a certain way. We see some things working, some things not working so well. We need to enable transition more. So we need to also, at some point, be more open to look at transitional technologies, make better use of them. We see China doing that. We see California doing that. That's very smart, because you enable transition, which actually helps you to reach the tipping points that you need to reach much earlier, and helps keep the transformation on track. So let's do it in a smarter way. It's strategic, it's existential. Yeah, we have not yet seen the outcomes of the strategic dialogue yet, but we have high expectations, and we hope the Commission will indeed also deliver on that.
Thank you, Sigrid, for that very clear explanation that we need enabling conditions to avoid a car crash. Arancha, what would you say are the most important issues for decarbonizing the European automotive sector, and what can we do about it?
Well, first, let me thank ACEA and the many stakeholders on the automotive value chain from beginning to end that have been part of this exercise. I mean, the very comfortable or uncomfortable, depending on how you look at it, position of, let's say, uncomfortable not trying to pick sides, because it's very clear that depending on where you sit, the interests may be short-term a little bit different, but in the very comfortable situation of understanding why we need to get this right, and what are the three questions we need to answer, and what I hope the strategic dialogue from the Commission will answer in a clear manner and giving a clear sense of direction. And I want to start by saying the automotive industry for the European Union, it's certainly growth, it's certainly jobs, it's certainly innovation, it's certainly structuring of territories. If one looks at where those producers of vehicles, but also components, sit around the European geography, they are also very important for the articulation of territories. But the automotive sector is also today the emblem of whether or not the European Union is serious about its strategic autonomy. So this is not just about an industry, it's an industry that represents the strategic autonomy ambitions of the European Union, hence why we need to get this right. I very much agree with both Marie-Pierre and Sigrid in the manner in which they have framed, especially the fact that the the transition has been thought through maybe without the necessary flexibilities and adjustments that a transition like this one, that is rather than a transition, more a revolution. So we haven't really thought through all the flexibilities and adjustments that you may need during a revolution of this sort. I also agree with this idea that a lot has been done, and now we are kind of moving backwards would almost be more costly than just simply proceeding if we were to proceed in an intelligent manner. So I think there is only one way forward in reality, other than just deciding that this is not the strategic autonomy, but I guess I'm taking this out of the table. There is only one way forward, that is to put together now a package that will rebalance the manner in which we will get to this revolution, to the end, to the management, to being in control of this revolution. And to me, this requires answering three fundamental questions. So let me put them on the table, because I guess this will help us then for round two. The first question has to do with how do we navigate the geopolitical difficulties of being in a sandwich between a dependency, at least in the short to medium term, from China on the batteries, that is what powers electric vehicles, and on the other side of the sandwich, a very volatile trade policy on the side of the United States. So first question is, and the first question that this strategic dialogue will have to answer, and the strategic plan will have to answer, is how do we navigate this geopolitical complexity so that the EU is not just in the sandwich, but maybe tries to put other elements on the menu on the table. Second question that needs to be answered is, how do we decarbonize? So what's the path? I don't think we need to question the end goal, because the end goal is a very powerful signal to all actors across the value chain. But how do we decarbonize? What's the path? How do we do that without being victims of the end goal? So what kinds of carrots, in addition to sticks and flexibilities, do we input in order to transition in a more intelligent manner? And the third question we have to answer is, what is a good industrial policy in the European Union context, in the fact that we are 27, we are not one, we are 27. What kind of industrial policy do we need to remain competitive? What kind of, I would suggest, systems approach industrial policy, multidimensional approach industrial policy we need in order to get to the end goal. So these are the three questions that, in my view, should inform the response from the European Commission to this strategic dialogue. I hope these are also the three questions that the European Parliament puts at the center of its efforts to support the European industry now get to the end goal. Back to you, Nicolas.
Thank you, Arancha. Marie-Pierre, we will rely on you to convey this message to your colleagues. Benjamin, joining us online. How prepared are Europe's automotive suppliers for the decarbonization transition?
Well, thank you. Thank you, first of all, for inviting me and giving me the chance to address the audience and join this esteemed panel. To your question, how prepared are the suppliers for this transformation? I'm not sure we have a special role here. It's us together with manufacturers as part of one industry. And the industry has invested significantly in this transformation. So in that sense, yes, a U-turn, my word now, or turning back, as Arancha, you said, is not an option. And that's also not what we're asking for. But what we need is a realistic timeline, a realistic strategy for this transformation with realistic timing, and feasible ambition. In there, I think we would do very well to focus on the political side to define the objectives, but to involve much more the ingenuity of the industry, the ideas of the engineers, to find out how we make that happen in the best possible way. And the best possible way must also be the most efficient and most affordable for people. In there, again, we have the regulations. We believe it is important in the short term to strengthen the role of technologies that can complement full electrification, because that is the way that makes it easier to achieve this transformation, makes it more efficient, makes it easier for people who are not yet convinced of full electrification to move towards this direction, addresses some of the concerns in there too, also allows us to play to European industrial strength, where we do have the competitive advantage over our competitors, and can get the competition a bit back towards our playing field, our end of the playing field. And I think that's important. Long term, we need to take a closer look at the CO2 regulations to also ensure that beyond 2035, we will be able to complement full electrification with others in the plug-in hybrid, for example, the range extender, hydrogen combustion, all those technologies that can contribute to reducing emissions, making this transformation more efficient and therefore quicker, and play to our industrial European strength.
Thank you all. Now, let's move on to our second theme, competitiveness. The automotive sector is, of course, one of the key pillars of a European industry, but it is under pressure from multiple directions. To the east, Chinese manufacturers have a high cost advantage in battery production. To our west, we're hearing seemingly changing news from the United States about their trade policy every day. So the question is, how can Europe keep a competitive edge in this very unstable environment? Sigrid, let's maybe start with you for these questions. European OEMs face a lot of stiff competition from Chinese firms now, including in the Chinese market. So where are we losing ground, and where would you say European firms still have an edge? And how can the EU respond to the tariff threats of the Trump administration?
Thank you. Yeah, that's a lot to cover. I'll try touch on them because indeed competitiveness has an internal and an external dimension very much. So if you look at the structural issues that need addressing on our home turf, also to, by the way, I think, support our economic security and resilience. Marie-Pierre already mentioned electricity prices, where we have a huge disadvantage compared to the United States, but also China. A bit broader than that, it's again about cost. The cost of manufacturing is higher in Europe than elsewhere. Now, I think Europe has never really, or at least not in the last few decades, tried to compete on cost necessarily, but being technology leaders, being innovative, being the productivity, also being system integrators, as it's called in the auto industry, where you are able to push out at very high volumes a product that is very complex. That is a skill and a competence in itself, and we've seen newer players in the auto industry also really struggling with that in recent years. So I think there are lots of strengths. Benjamin just also said, let's play our strengths more. I fully agree with that. We have a lot to go for, and that's also why it's really way too early to give up on this industry, and that's why it's actually so right and understandable that policymakers have recognized that there is something at stake here, and that this is a critical industry and needs supporting and carefully looking at to make sure that we keep thriving in Europe. And it's also, I think, an illustration of that very understanding that economies like the Chinese have put so much effort into building up an auto industry because it supports their domestic economies, but also then at some point turns into an exporting force. So electricity prices, cost of manufacturing is too high, and there indeed we also run into fragmentation that is natural to the EU, so that's something to cope with, but also to look at. Administrative burden, and I think with the omnibus that's coming, and again also a commissioner in the Commission for simplification and reducing administrative burden is really important, and it's recognized. But I'd like to say also a word about the regulatory framework as such, because whereas China has a very directive policy and they orchestrate, the US really incentivizes a lot of carrots, very clear, predictable, also through tax breaks, which is much more difficult, of course, in the EU context. The EU tends to regulate how it wants to then roll out industrial policy. And I think it needs to review that. And I think Mario Draghi identified this as well as a key point, and he has written a very, I think, rich and interesting chapter on the automotive industry in his much larger, I think it's 900 pages report, which is really worth looking at with good recommendations. But the regulatory framework, which is so defining for the success of industries, businesses at large in Europe, and also for the auto industry, because the vehicle is one of the most regulated products that you can find on the market, it really needs looking at. And this is not so much changing the content or the substance of the regulation, but how you match paper reality. So regulation is first of all text, legal text on paper, with industrial cycles, industrial reality. And to make this a bit more concrete, because I understand this might sound very abstract, you could, for example, adhere to 3 very clear principles going forward. Regulate only new types of vehicles and don't force to having to change all the existing vehicles on the production in the production cycle as well. Do a coherency check upfront because there is type approval for vehicles, but there is a lot of horizontal policy like REACH, for chemicals or other types of regulation that impact also the production of vehicles, where coherency and streamlining and again matching better with industrial realities would help. And also look at harmonizing as far as possible lead times. So you have more predictability as a manufacturer when you put something on the market and when there is a text and when you have to implement it in your actually engineering reality. So what we would like to see, so one of the points in this strategic dialogue and the action plan for the automotive industry coming out is the announcement of an omnibus for the automotive sector. I think that would make a lot of sense, and we've heard the Commission also say there will be a number of more horizontal omnibus proposals covering industries, others in a broader sense, but there will be a number of sectoral omnibus proposals as well, and we believe it makes a lot of sense to have that closer look also on the automotive industry, and we hope that also the European Parliament would support that proposal. I'll stop here. I can talk for ages about competitiveness and what it takes, but these are a few important points. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Benjamin, let's turn to you. A lot of automotive suppliers have relatively small margins, so when we see rising production costs in Europe, how does that affect the competitiveness of automotive suppliers? And what can we do about it?
Oh dear. I would say many companies in the supply industry even don't have a profit margin anymore. We have numbers that show us that 2/3 of the industry just arrive at maximum 5% profitability. 1/4 of the industry is loss-making. And that is a result of many factors. One is the sandwich position between significant investments in electrification, but not yet seeing the return on these investments. Other factors are, of course, bureaucratic burden, high energy prices, all those that have already been mentioned. So what can we do about it? Competitiveness, I mentioned the regulatory environment already, that tends to bind our arms behind our back when we want to compete with other markets in some aspects, and I mentioned them already. We need to look at the enablers for electrification, charging infrastructure, refueling infrastructure. We need to also look at securing manufacturing innovation in the EU in the competition with other markets. there we need to see that the playing field remains level. There's also something to be said about funding, and that's maybe interesting really on the European level, because there's a lot of good work already going on in the context of pre-competitive research, for example. This is successful. It could, of course, be better and less bureaucratic, but it is fundamentally successful. We are a bit concerned about what we hear when it comes to budget negotiations and the future of the funding for pre-competitive research. We think it should be strengthened rather than reduced. Also here, of course, it is important to note simplification and better alignment of funding initiatives is important. CapEx support can help finance investments and increase productivity. We need to make sure that the instruments are aligned, are in sync. The Clean Industrial State Aid Framework should cover the same technologies as the Net Zero Industry Act, for example. Scope of Clean Industrial State Aid Framework is too limited in comparison. And there's something to be said about funding between pre-competitive research and the IPCEIs. So there's a lot of work, there's a lot of good work that can be done, a lot of good ideas that are out there. And again, it has been said before, I really hope that these points are going to be covered in the action plan and in the tangible next steps that the Commission is going to propose in order to support the competitiveness of industry overall, and certainly the automotive industry in there, and then in the discussion between Parliament and Council, of course.
Thank you. Marie-Pierre, what do you think is the most important issue affecting competitiveness of the automotive industry?
Like I said on the beginning, I think that the question of the price of energy, and you mentioned also this, is very important. If we want to continue to produce inside the EU, for us and in the Parliament, we think that it's a very key question, especially like you said, because now we have a global framework with very, very difficult, and we see that always this question, if a question also, and we will talk about this after, for weaponize our strategy, also to pressure. We see with the question with Donald Trump tariff, we try to have transactional approach also on this question of energy. So I think that we need also to have a clear strategy on this, how we produce energy also in Europe, how we work on this, how we move forward, how we secure our approvisionment. And I think, like you said, we need to have coherency between our internal and external policy. I think that during the previous mandate, we work a lot of internal policy, and we put a lot of legislation on Green Deal, other area, affect the production inside EU, and we try to create with our legislation a sort of level playing field, but it is not the case, especially because now we have Donald Trump in US, but we have also China, we have also third actors who are very clear of the alignment between internal and external policy. And at this moment, it's not the case inside the EU, because we are not working on how we have clear strategy at industrial, very European industrial policy, like you said, very clear trade policy who are very useful in order to protect and to continue to be open, but not naive in the openness, and to work on the future of our competition also policy. So I think also we need to work on how trade in competition policy and industrial policy really promote the competitiveness and the production inside EU. To continue to be open, because we don't all produce inside the EU. And the question also is how we implement industrial policy in order to have a strong internal market. And it's true that I think you mentioned Draghi report, there is a lot of proposition on the table, but I think also the Leta report shows that we need to really build a real internal market. And like you mentioned burden administrative aspect, but on other area, I think that the mistake for you in order to guarantee our competitiveness is not to really have internal market. We succeed, and with Pascal Lamy at the Commission, with Jacques Delors, we really act on this, and we have two pillars. We have the pillar of very work on economic aspect, but also on social aspect to really build the two legs of internal market. And I think that sometimes after we forget this with some legislation. So I think now the key question for the Parliament is how we have strong relationship between internal and external policy.
Thank you. Arancha, is the EU automotive industry falling behind competitors that have more long-term visions for the industrial policy, or are just more hard-nosed when it comes to trade policy?
No, I mean, I leave I guess, the external competitiveness discussion for last, because that's, I guess, what you want to discuss in economic security. But I don't think the European Union and the industry has a problem of not being good enough. They are best in class, but there are things that are not working. And if we are to fix this, what's not working on the competitiveness side, let me give you 4 things that I think would be essential to fix, to continue to give the industry this capacity to remain best in class. The first one is, Benjamin has mentioned this, we have the best brains in the world. If you look at where patents are filed, largest filing of patents also in this sector is in the European Union. But we are not bringing research and development to market. So what we need there is the instruments that allow us to bring the research and development to market. And this is, in particular, essential in the component of the electric vehicle where Europe does not have today an autonomy, and that's batteries. So we need a more decisive, the IPCCs are very good, but we need to make them much more market-oriented. Second concrete suggestion that I hope comes out of this dialogue is we need a specific action on batteries and components. And maybe the experience that we have had with the batteries and components need also a bit of a recalibration. Lots of things are happening in this sector. So we are signing global gateways agreements with third countries in order to get better access to raw materials. But we now need to invest more in refining capacities, in processing capacities, through external, through trade agreements, through investment agreements, or internally. We need a specific circular economy action on processing of the materials that would allow us to expand battery capacity. So the second one would be more specifically battery and components for batteries, because that's where medium to long term we need to build a resilience vis-a-vis China that today has a very large capacity in this space and therefore can exercise power over this very strong position it has. I wouldn't call it monopoly, but in some of the components is pretty much a monopoly. Third one has been mentioned by Marie-Pierre, is on the social side. We've got today a social climate fund. In my view, it would make a lot of sense to take part of this towards an EV transition fund. Why? Because there is all the supplier to the automotive sector that we need to reskill, upskill, and this would need financing. Fourth and final on the competitiveness side, and I'm not going to repeat what Sigrid has said because I'm very much aligned with that on the regulatory side. But the fourth element I would like to put on the table has to do with incentives, consumer incentives, and not just for the personal vehicle. If I look at the industrial vehicles, if I look at trucks, if I look at buses, this is a space where the uptake is even lower than for the personal cars. So this is where we need a much more decisive action. Member states do this in different ways. Some do it in the form of, like France, you buy, you get a check. Some, like in my home country, they do this with a tax deduction when you do your tax filing. Some are very generous, some are really testimonial, not really changing customer behavior, but we need incentives that will change customer behavior, because at the end of the day, you need to work on the supply and you need to work on the demand. Back to you.
Thank you. That's a great segue to the last theme of our discussion today, which is economic security. And of course, this is really the topic of the day. The dependencies are not new, but the new geopolitical environment, I think, is really exposing our vulnerabilities here. So how should Europe handle this going forward in a more and more difficult geopolitical environment? And how can de-risking actually look like in practice without falling into a trap of protectionism? So Benjamin, let's maybe start with you this time. How do your members deal with supply chain disruptions and this difficult new environment?
Thank you. Yes, and you mentioned it already. It's not about decoupling. It's not about building up barriers to other regions in the world. On the contrary, I think we need to double down on keeping ourselves integrated in international trade. We are, by definition, and to the very foundations of our genes, a global industry, and it only makes sense to do that as a global industry. So in that sense, what the Commission is currently doing and what as a European strategy currently implementing bilaterally, and even if I can dream multilaterally, we should stick to it. We need to work further on ratification of trade agreements, Mercosur, Mexico, India, but also make sure that these trade agreements are built on a reciprocal basis. They weigh the interests, as we are doing, and that they contribute to a level playing field. Diversification of raw material and energy supply, that has already been mentioned. We cannot afford in a transition to, if it were to be full electrification, full battery electrification, that we switch a dependency of energy imports to a maybe even more pronounced dependency on imports of raw materials and batteries from the only one country that everybody knows, which I mean. We need to make sure that we avoid this, creating new dependencies here by keeping our supply chains diversified, and I would also argue by keeping our technology mix diversified. I would keep it at that. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Arancha, are we at risk of supply chain disruptions if the current tensions escalate?
We are, and not only are we at risk, is that we are seeing already disruptions in the market. So, and that's precisely what we have to build a hedge against. So let me focus on the two elephants that Benjamin has not mentioned. Let me mention China and the US, because at the end of the day, I very much agree with this idea that we need a robust trade policy with lots of agreements that have been negotiated and now require action on the Parliament. So on this, we are all going to look at Marie-Pierre and her capacity, together with her colleagues, to push these agreements forward, because they are part of the resilience that Europe needs in order to limit the volatility on the China and on the US market. But let me tackle China and the US. First, on China. We have to avoid being naive, and we have to avoid pretending to be aggressive, but setting objectives that we will not meet, like the objective of decoupling from China. So what we need is a functional trade relationship with China, which at the moment we don't have. Now, what would I put in this functional relationship with China on trade? I would put 3 ingredients, and I hope the Chinese would also put these 3 ingredients on the table. But my sense is that they are mature to have this conversation with Europe if Europe decides to have this conversation. The first one would be what I call open for open, fair for fair. It's true that with the volatility on the US market, access to the European market becomes more valuable for China. It's true that with the volatility of the American market, the openness of the Chinese market is more valuable for Europe. So open for open, we keep our markets open, they keep our markets open, and we make sure that we both play by the rules of the game. Second element that I would put in this functional relationship is no weaponization of trade interdependencies. So you don't weaponize batteries, raw materials, access to this product or that product because you have a bee in your bonnet for other political issues. Third, it's got to do with investments. European investments are welcome in China. China has conditions for those investments. Chinese investments are welcomed in Europe, and Europe sets conditions for those investments in Europe. So, I mean, I think we can't frame this, and in my view, we should be careful not to fall behind in this conversation with China, just in case the US and China have this conversation before we have it. Second, for the US, I think it's no secret, because it's the front page of the newspapers, that the automobile sector will be part of the targets of protectionist policies by the Trump administration. I think it's no secret that there is a bargain to be had with the US, the bargain hopefully to lower, not to increase. And three, there is, in my view, pretty clear also that if there is no agreement, there will be retaliation. And this will not be nice, because the industry, which, by the way, sits on both sides, American companies producing in Europe, European companies producing on the US side, will be impacted. Now, on the US side, I think any deal with the US on the automobile sector should cover not only tariffs, but also the other part that can also be instrumentalized for protectionist reasons, which is VAT, regulatory frameworks, fuel taxes, all the regulatory environment that the European Union has developed that could also become part of the unilateral measures from the US administration, and I hope they are also tackled in the mix. So in a way, a functional relationship with China and a functional relationship with the US, and let's try to be smart, because the last thing we would want to have is the US and China doing that, and we sitting watching it.
Indeed, let's not sit on our hands. Marie-Pierre, has the EU been doing enough to protect the economic security of its automotive sector?
Oh, no. But thank you for being focused on China and US. And maybe with some French, we are ready to say that we need more free trade agreement. And also good cooperation and a new framework with the Mercosur. I assume to say that as a French, me, personally. But you know that it's sometimes very difficult when we are talking about free trade agreement. And I think that with a lot of people and with industrial actors, we need to explain really what it means and what it means concretely in the daily life, on industry, and in the daily life also for consumers. Because that I think that when we are talking on free trade agreement, of course in France, but also in other member states, it's true that it's used by other actors as a tool for coercion, but inside the EU, the discussion is used by other actors as politician measure also inside the EU. So I think that we need to really explain why we need free trade agreement and what it means concretely for our industry to continue to be open. And like you said, I assume to say that we need to be open, because at the end, we are not able to produce all in Europe. We are not able to have some raw material in Europe. Sometimes when I go back in Brittany, I say to my citizen, okay, we want EV. We need lithium, for example, for the battery. Are you ready to have some exploitation inside Brittany? Say, oh, no, maybe. So we need agreement with third country in order to have a resilient value chain on this aspect. And when we have free trade agreement, we have a framework in order to work together and to put also some common objective on the table. So open, yes, but not openness for openness. Exactly like you mentioned, openness in order to build partnership. And I think on the Chinese, if I have also another message, because you know that the European Parliament and some members in the European Parliament are under sanction. And in fact, it's why we don't have inside the Parliament high-level discussion on this. So Chinese need to move on this in order to have this kind of discussion and to find solution. Because the question in how we build also industry inside the EU, but also in China, in order to have also development in China. Because the question of free trade agreement is how, with this kind of tool, we build prosperity and stability. So I think that, yes, we need to say, we, as Europe, we continue to be open. And we continue to promote a rule-based system. We are ready to do that, but we want a fair system. So it's why during the previous mandate, we strengthened our toolbox, because the world is changing, and the toolbox only based on free trade agreement is not enough. So now we have already trade defense instrument, anti-subvention, anti-dumping, but now we have anti-coercion tool, we have foreign subsidy, we have public procurement. Also, public procurement, it was not because we want to be closed. No, we want to continue to be open, and we want that the other action act fairless. So I think we need also to work maybe on through free trade agreement, and also to continue to have a common doctrine with member states, because we know that we have some trouble with member states, not, I think, with the Commission on this, on how really we have a common doctrine of economic security. What are the risks, and how, as Union, we are ready to respond. And I think that sometimes, on this area also, the European Commission is more ready to act with China, with US, and the difficulty is in the capitals. And I think also that sometimes the European Parliament is more ready to act in this way than the capital.
Thank you. Sigrid, your members have a global footprint. How worried are you about decoupling scenarios, export restrictions?
Yes, indeed. I mean, our main priorities as automotive industry, and therefore also as ACEA in this year, are a reality check when it comes to the decarbonization strategy, improving competitiveness really substantially and tangibly. But the third element is really about international trade, because trade is an incredibly important factor for the success of the automotive industry. 1 in every 3 vehicles manufactured in Europe are destined for the export market. So yeah, it's incredibly important that this is well managed, and the current tensions are unfortunate, and we should do everything we can to avoid escalation and avoid a trade war, both with the US but also with China. So much has been said already of where to look at, what to do. It's incredibly complex, because indeed you need to partner with China. They're very dominant in a technology that we rely on in Europe for our green transition. also in the automotive industry. So the battery value chain development of that within Europe is very important. But we will rely for a long time to come on raw material, also components and technology coming from China. So we need indeed to find a workable partnership there, and it takes two to tango. So yes, we can be assertive and rely on our strengths, but we also need to be pragmatic and and find a good way forward there. On the US, likewise, I mean, we have Commissioner Šefčovič in the US, or maybe he's on his way back, I don't know now, but to talk with the administration there to try and avoid, I think, escalation. It's probably true that cars, being a very spotlighted and tangible product, are used as a, I wouldn't say bargaining chip, but as a force to get some things on other issues. That is dangerous because the impact on the automotive industry might actually be substantial. And you mentioned it, Arancha, there is a lot of vehicle manufacturing in the US by ACEA members, and they support local employment and also export, by the way, a lot. So yeah, if you look at the actual facts, things are more nuanced than they may seem sometimes if you listen to President Trump. So yeah, economic security is really rooted in maintaining as much as possible the global free and fair trade system. It's very much under pressure. We feel more in a power-based system than in a rules-based system. China as a new competitor, that was around already for a while. It's become even more complex now, and the risk is to be really squeezed. So we rely on EU policymakers to be very active and sensible in managing this challenge.
Thank you. As I mentioned at the outset, we're going to finish a couple minutes early today so that our panelists can all make their next appointments. But I think we have time for a couple of questions. So I'm going to open it up to the audience. Please raise your hand and introduce yourself quickly.
Hi, I'm Amy Sandu from BASF. I'm in the battery materials business. And I have a question regarding something that the panelists brought up in terms of this kind of more nuanced approach to trade defense instruments. So it's a question to everyone, actually, whoever wants to take it. You know, we said that the EU or the US incentivizes, China directs, and the EU regulates, right? And I think the US has this extra advantage of, you know, being able to put out executive orders at breakneck speed. China, that's the advantage of their political regime, and the EU has possibly one of the most complex legislative systems that I've seen in my career. So when we think about the battery business, so we're BASF, you know, producer of cathode active materials and the precursor, we're in a build-up phase in Europe. It's a nascent industry. And I want to get the panelists' opinion on, do you see a scenario whereby legislation could go in the direction where at the beginning of this build-up phase, there's a recognition of production costs, there's a recognition that we can't necessarily be autonomous because of lack of refining capacity, strategic dependencies on raw materials, and where this could look a little bit more open? For example, now I'll be very concrete on the TCA guidelines. For cathode active materials, we are looking at what the possibility is of a certain percentage of non-originating material, right, at the beginning, and then seeing something whereby as the timeline progresses and the industry is able to build up, then you slowly close that, becoming more, let's say, quote-unquote, protectionist. That's my first question. The second question is just on the panelists' thoughts on, you know, we see a lot of this key message going around that we need to be taking advantage of the technology transfer from China, right? And you know, our position is that definitely restricting market access is not the right thing to do, considering the economies of scale and innovation and technological know-how that China brings. But I also think it's naive to believe that they would be so generous in their technology transfer. And so how do you feel we can rather use this foreign direct investment screening, perhaps studying their model, to better benefit from China's presence? We see the rapid rise in Hungary, for example, but also joint ventures in other parts of Europe. So those two questions. Thanks.
Thank you. Let's take two more questions before we go back to the panel.
Thank you. My name is Martin Klemmer from Ford Motor Company. I have a question on the simplification agenda. We have mentioned the omnibus proposal that is upcoming, especially on sustainability. And this morning I've seen that the colleagues from S&D in the European Parliament have already sent a very strongly worded letter to the European Commission in terms of questioning what is going on there. And maybe my question to Marie-Pierre, and I know it's difficult, but what is your assessment of the mood in the European Parliament concerning simplification and harmonization of laws? Will that be a battle, everyone against everyone, or do lawmakers recognize the need for some of these actions that the Commission now will bring forward? Thank you.
Thank you. One last question. Now's your chance.
Thank you. I'm from the office of MEP Miriam Lexman from Slovakia, and we've recently had a case in Slovakia where the Chinese company Gotion has pretty much confirmed their investment with a very big battery company, which raised a lot of questions with the locals regarding environmental protection, regarding the Chinese secret police that comes usually with the Chinese employers. Maybe what are your thoughts of all of the panelists on the EU steps towards these investments? Is it a good step, or how should EU overall look at these problems? Thank you.
Thank you. Let's go back to the panel. Who would like to respond?
On the question of the mood on the Parliament on simplification, it will be very difficult, frankly, because it's true that as legislator, when we work during 5 years on some file, and now you have to say, okay, I made mistake, it's not very easy. No. So it's true that from different groups, they want to change nothing. I think that all the group, for example, EPP want to move really forward on simplification. But some people in EPP, it's not only to really work on simplification, sometimes it's more deregulation. And in Renew, we have a lot of battle. So it will be very tricky, but my personal view, and I have also battled in my own delegation on this. We need to change something, and we need to reopen some text, frankly. I vote in favor on CSRD, on due diligence, and I think that the world is completely changing. And I have some colleagues who say, okay, Marie-Pierre, yeah, but we vote in April, so why we change? Because, yes, the world is changing, but I think we need also to admit that the principle on this text we share this. When I have discussion with, of course, automotive sector, but also other sector, all the people share the target on decarbonization. We talk about this, all the people. But we create sometimes big Excel, but we are not efficient on the target with this kind of legislation. So I think we need to say at the European Parliament, okay, sometimes we made mistake. And the world is changing, so it's really important to say that we need to change some legislation. Maybe to put on the table first, this text is not the good choice, because now it's a battle on deregulation and regulation. And in fact, I think that I try to discuss with some of my colleagues to say it's not the question. The question is how really we achieve the goal. And so, is the legislation a good legislation in order to achieve, or is not the case? And I think that, for example, on CSRD, on due diligence, we have too much KPI on the table. And at the end, it's not the good KPI and it's not the really good action on the global value chain. So I'm ready to say that sometimes we made some mistake and I'm ready to change. But it's not globally the mood in the parliament. So it will be very difficult because we have also the question of the majority UVDL inside the parliament. And you know that the European Parliament is completely different. On the question of generally technology transfer, the case of Slovakia, I think we have a lot of discussion in International Trade Committee, and you know that now we are working on the revision of FDI, and I think that we are agree in the Parliament to say that we need to continue to be open, we need to continue to be attractive, but exactly like you said, not to be naive on the investment, on the choice of some actors, on some source country. So it's why it's just the first steps of the doctrine of common economy security. So for us, yes, not to be naive, but really to have the good tool in order to have really efficient transfer of technology. And I think when I have discussion with some actors and industrial actors, they say that there is sometimes really technology transfer. So we need also to discuss, like we do this morning, with industrial actors to see in the legislation how it's possible to really have transfer of technology and to move forward on this. But I think that in the Parliament and with the Commission and with stakeholders, sometimes we have it on the table. But it's true that we know that we need also to strengthen the collaboration between member states and with the Commission also on this to avoid, for example, the case on Slovakia.
Thank you. Does anybody else want to take this question of flipping the script on Chinese FDI?
So, on FDI, the question in my view is to avoid a race to the bottom. And this is in the hands of member states today. Of course, if you're ready to attract an investor by saying, I lower my working standards, I lower my environmental standards, I lower this, I lower that, it's not going to be very productive in my view. It's going to be extractive. And what we're looking for is an investment framework, whether it's with China or with anybody else, that is not extractive, that it works. It works also for the country and for the companies in the country that are trying to attract this investment. The difficulty we have today is that the legislation at the European level on foreign direct investment is much tilted to member states as opposed to centrally within the European Commission. The FDI screening gives a hook, and my sense is that we should use this hook also to avoid the partner negotiating with the member state a race to the bottom, which would immediately oblige the rest of the members to align to the bottom. So it's in the interest of the EU to have a more community-based mechanism on investments. Second, on tech transfer, look, the interesting thing is that we are now in the situation in Europe with China that European companies were in China 20, 30 years ago. So when the European investors, or American investors for that purpose, started going to China, the Chinese understood that they didn't just want to have low local value-added operations. They wanted to be able to benefit from the investment in terms of learning, in terms of labor, in terms of knowledge diffusion across the value chain. And this is, I guess, what we want today in Europe, in sectors like batteries, where the Chinese partner is more advanced than we are today. So that's, in my view, how we should frame it. We have to be careful with saying that it's naive, because then if it's naive in Europe, then it was naive in China when they ask us, right? So in my view, what we're looking for is to be able to benefit locally from the investors' presence in the European market. Final point, but this is more a piece of advice. You take it or you leave it, because, with university professors, this is the best, is that you give lots of advice and then the others take it or leave it. We have to be careful in this agenda of reducing the burden of the regulatory framework in Europe. If I were in your shoes, I would not use deregulation. I would use simplification. Now, it may sound like a bit of rhetorical, but it's not. What you have at the moment is a huge burden for companies because of the manner in which the EU legislation is produced. It's produced vertically, and it's assessed by the European Parliament vertically. The committee on this, the committee on this, the committee on this. Now, the industry is horizontal. So why do you have to have 1,000 KPIs? Why do you have to have different compliance reporting mechanisms? Because it's been produced vertically. That's what you should be asking to change. Now, others want also to use the opportunity to change the objective. Up to you. I mean, it's not my game, but I think that's where you will find resistance. You should be very clear that the manner in which the EU produces legislation today is not adapted to the realities of businesses that are operating in a horizontal manner across EU member states, across jurisdiction, and across thematic areas, which is how the European Parliament, the Commission, and by the way, national governments, too, are organized.
A quick one, perhaps? I understand all the discussions about nascent industries because we need to reach scale to develop this battery chain and the broader value chain in Europe. But we also need to be very careful in how we do this. And I think the challenge now for Europe is to navigate really a narrow path between protection and protectionism. Because it sounds nice to say we should put all kinds of requirements, but that will also drive up cost, which would then kill the benefits that you actually want to derive, would be offset. So you need to really find a careful balance there before you do that. And that's why we believe that there may be some measures needed, can all be talked about, but in the end, we really need to address the fundamental structural challenges when it comes to competitiveness of Europe itself. Do something about that. And Draghi, again, has given a good lead for that. Mandated regulation, mandates, there is really a downside to that as well, so we need to be very careful.
Thank you so much, and thank you, everyone.
Before we stop, since we are on last words, maybe also from my side, a quick one, because these questions were really interesting that we have heard just now about the nuanced approach, and I can't agree more with Sigrid. We are in a new paradigm. Up until now, it was very easy. More trade is good, and even more free trade is better. That's no longer exactly the case. But we need to navigate that new environment. We need to study, we need to understand what the options are in order to react to these new developments before we take decisions, and to make sure that we don't risk on the back end results, implications that we don't want to see in them. About simplification, also there, I don't think it's about mistakes or errors so much. It is about focusing what is working, really asking also questions, what is not working, what do we want to achieve, and then to adjust, and also to adjust to the changing framework that we are working in. And that is, again, it's not so much about who made errors or who was right. It is about the smart way forward, focusing on what works, focusing what brings us forward, and what are our priorities, really. We are in a world in which, unfortunately, we cannot afford all of what we had in the past years, where sometimes regulations were also looking good on paper, or policies were looking good on paper, but did not in reality then lead to the outcomes that we wanted to see there, but come at a cost. And there we need to focus. if we want to achieve independence or more independence, and with full electrification, and we need to solve the issue of raw materials and refining, and if we want this not only coming from trade partners, we will need to accept that inside the European Union. But there's a reason, I think, why this is not happening in the European Union, because refining is dirty, mining is dirty. If we want that, if we want to have safe supply, also from sources inside the European Union, yes, recycling will be very important, but it's not going to be the only thing. I think there we need to ask a few hard questions, and we won't be able to avoid these questions because there are other regions in the world which are making real pressure. Sigrid, you said we may be no longer so much in a rules-based system, but also already in a strength-based system. We need to focus on what is increasing European strength and competitiveness. And there, I think we had the right questions today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for this very engaging conversation we had today. I think one thing is clear, that there are no simple solutions. The strategic triangle that Pascal Lamy mentioned in his opening remarks between decarbonization, competitiveness, and economic security will continue to be an issue. I think one thing that is clear is that the automotive industry is at a critical juncture right now, so the decisions we will take in the next couple of weeks will probably influence this industry for years to come. So thank you for all your excellent questions today. Please go ahead and download our report on the website of the Jacques Delors Institute, and we look forward to continuing this discussion with you. Thank you again, and have a wonderful day.